Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Andrei Bezrikov, and this is the open session of the Strategic Intelligence Program. Strategic intelligence is about looking beyond the horizon. This is about proactively reducing strategic uncertainty for decision makers. And we are now living quite extraordinary times. We are at the time when all the tectonic plates of geopolitics are shifting, when the old rules are no longer valid, and when new rules are appearing. We're also at the very extraordinary place. We are in Moscow today. This is a focal point of contact, and I would even say of confrontation of our two largest shifting tectonic plates. And we do not have a very clear idea whether those shifts will slowly dissipate or we will have a very violent earthquake. From the point of view of strategic intelligence, it is very important to understand the underlying forces, the deep drivers of what's going on. And there are very few people in the world who are able to explain it with such a force and clarity as George Fridman. When I was a young intelligence officer, I was using George's reading to vaccinate myself from, I'm sorry for the word, the flow of a bullshit that you would get from media. And thank you to George, I developed a better ability to separate the events which are really significant from the noise. This is the first time George is coming to Moscow. Well, privately, I can tell you that American Airlines desperately trying to abort this trip, but we succeeded. So, George is a founder and chairman of Stratfor, probably the most known private intelligence agency dealing with strategic forecasting and strategic intelligence. He is probably the most important authority right now on geopolitics. So please welcome George Fridman. Let me establish some ground rules. George will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So please don't be shy.
Only in Moscow would it be assumed that American Airlines was conspiring against me. We Americans never believe in conspiracies. Thank you for coming tonight. I didn't think I would ever lecture on geopolitics in Moscow, because being my age, Moscow was a place of danger and darkness. And now I see it's not. So, let's talk about Stratfor for a second and its name. The origin of its name really is strategic forecasting. In 1995, when we started the business, and it is a business, we are freer by selling what we know than by asking for money from the government or things like that. When we started it, I decided that it was too hard to type www.strategicforecasting.com. So we shortened it to Stratfor, because after all, who was going to use the internet? I mean, it's not important. Out of that, we got the name Stratfor. I wouldn't have picked it myself. It grew. I had no choice. And this is the first lesson to begin with. We live with some choices, but mostly they are the illusion of choices. We think we can shape our lives any way we want, but in fact, our lives are severely constrained. If that were not true, then we could predict nothing. The entire idea of forecasting is based on the idea of some sort of necessity, and out of that necessity comes prediction. I wrote a book a few years ago in which I predicted that there would be a conflict between Russia and the West, particularly the United States, over Ukraine. It was not an isolated guess. It derived from a method. That method allows us to think through some things, not perfectly, but it's not magic. And it's not guesswork, and it's not luck. And it is the heart of intelligence. In the end, all intelligence is about forecasting. Whether you are going to get a bit of information that will allow your president to know what the American president will say at the next meeting, or whether you're going to predict the future of your country. This is the task of intelligence. Now, many in intelligence believe that the purpose of intelligence is to pass around bits of paper to each other and have arguments with each other. Who will get what budget? But that is a very important side product, a byproduct of intelligence. The core of intelligence is knowing what will happen somehow and in some way. So how do we do this? Well, we begin by appreciating two things. All of us are born someplace. And where you are born makes a tremendous difference in what choices you have. If you are born in Iceland, or if you are born in the Congo, or if you are born in New York, or if you are born in Smolensk, the moment of birth, many things drop away as possibilities. And the heart of forecasting is understanding that which is impossible. Not what is possible, what is impossible. So if you are born to a poor family in the Congo, enormous amounts of things are impossible. And I can predict, to some degree, what your life will be like. If you are born to a very wealthy family in New York, other things are impossible. I can't become a beggar, where it's very unlikely. There are many things I can't be. So when we consider a human being and the moment of birth, we already see how much falls away. And that which remains becomes the sheaf of possibilities. And then we discover that you're not very smart. And we discover that you are very smart. And we discover that you can't get along with other people. And we discover that you are wonderful with people, and on and on. And as these things from your birth emerge, the choices in your life become narrower and narrower and narrower. And as you grow older, and you fall in love and you get married, this closes off other opportunities. And as you decide to become a student at this university, this opens up opportunities and closes opportunities. So think of the individual life and how much choice there is. When you reach my age and you look back on it, life actually starts to make sense. What appeared to be a series of random, incoherent choices, that I would create a company in Texas that does strategic forecasting, which I never imagined would be the case. It happened, sort of. But when I look back, I say, where else could it all wind up? I was interested in intelligence. I was interested in forecasting. I couldn't stand the place I was. What else could I have done? But I was an American, hence this was possible. Had I been Chinese, this may not have been so possible. And so when you have a close, almost molecular understanding of a life, you can look back on it and see that it tells a story. And that story is not a surprise. Who is it the greatest surprise to? To the person who lived it. To that person, it's a surprise. So that when you talk to decision makers, they very rarely know why they're making the decision. They're dealing with this moment. They don't see where it's leading. It's when you step back at a distance that you can begin to see the tapestry. And this is what Machiavelli said in The Prince, in the introduction, when he said, "Forgive me, my prince, for writing these things about you, but sometimes it is easier to see the truth at a distance from the mountain than sitting on the mountaintop." And this was a critical lesson. The intention of people and what comes out of it are very different. It is the unintended consequences, unintended in the sense of it was not subjectively what you wished or thought you wished. Okay? It is the unintended consequences that you can see if you're not that person. It is much easier for me to see what will happen to one of you if I really knew you than for you to see. Because your views are filled with wishes, illusions, desires, misconceptions. I have no such burden. And so those who think that intelligence is finding out what the president thinks of either of our countries will be badly disillusioned. Presidents are more like each other than they are like us. Why? If you're the president of the United States, 330 million people. If you're the president of Russia, I don't know how much the count is now, 180 million, I think? I'm not sure. 120, I'm sorry. 140. But 140, but one of you is worth more than just one, so it's all right. The point is, to become the leader of a country requires a certain extraordinary discipline. You don't just bop along, as we say in the States, and one day, hey, why did I become president? You focus your life on power. And the ability to focus yourself so ruthlessly, so in a disciplined way, that you, among all the hundreds of millions of others who could become president, that you are the one who becomes that, shapes you in an extraordinary way. It doesn't necessarily make you nicer. It doesn't necessarily make you smarter. But there's one thing that the President of the United States and the President of Russia have in common. They know how to be president, and they knew how to become president. And so if we begin with that understanding, and we take a look at what they worry about every day, do they worry about 30 years from now? Do they worry about what will happen in the area of computing? They worry about how to remain president. And in that worry, that shapes their mind. And out of their actions come the unintended consequences. When I was younger and we were studying your country, the Americans, like your people, tried to get every bit of information they could get out of your Politburo. And the assumption was the higher you went, the more they knew. And if you could only get their telephone conversations, their emails or mails at that time, if you just got those, you would know what would happen. And one of the interesting things was that those who followed all of the details of what Gorbachev and every other member of the Politburo were saying were the last to know what would happen. Because Gorbachev was the last to know what was going to happen. The assumption that source-based intelligence operates from is that the knowledge of long-term events is contained in the leader's head. The leader isn't even thinking about long-term events, sometimes not even about short-term events. He's trying to figure out how to stay president. The danger of source-based intelligence, which both our countries love, is that you assume the source has any idea of what he's talking about. You say, well, he's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, or he's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Surely he knows. I've known Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and I can assure you they have no idea. Their question is, how can they become Deputy Secretary of State? Their question is, how can they move their careers? It is not exclusively that. They also want to deal with their jobs, their countries, and everything else, but they're focused on the moment. And so if you ask them what will happen, they will tell you what they wish would happen. They will tell you what they think you want to hear. Sources are the most dangerous thing in intelligence. They're the most dangerous thing in intelligence not because they lie, of course they lie. Not because you'll misinterpret them, of course you'll misinterpret them. They're dangerous because they have no content. They have no knowledge. And this we find over and over and over again. Hitler did not think he would have to commit suicide in a bunker. Stalin did not think he would be invaded. Only Churchill had some idea, but not much. The point is not that they're stupid, it is that they're not focused on the things you may be focused on. They may not be clear on that may not drive them. So the most important thing that we have to do whenever we talk to a friend is understand what they're thinking. But that's impossible because you can't read their minds. Much better to understand the forces that are shaping them. A friend who wants to be a Hollywood actor, who's incredibly ugly, probably you know this is not going to happen unless they need very ugly people. And every once in a while. So if you think about life of the individual, you will begin to understand how often your friends are delusional and you have a better idea of what's going to happen to them, and you can do strategic forecasting of their lives, and you do. And this is called gossip. And all of you do, and you listen, and you analyze, and you think, and you understand what's going to happen. Now, along with birth comes something that I call love of one's own. You are born to a mother. And your mother may be an idiot, vicious, but you love her. Why? Because it is the most natural thing in the world, the easiest love, the first love. And if your father's there, most of your fathers, I think, would be there, you would love him too. This requires no thought. And this is a driving element, because if you love them, you derive your language from them, maybe your religion from them, maybe your hatred of religion from them, maybe they hate religion, therefore you love religion from them, but your life is shaped by them. And their lives, in turn, were shaped by previous generations, and here you have history. And they don't live alone, they live in a community. It could be a tribe, a Greek polis, or modern nation state. But when you are born in a nation state, you have a language, you have a set of beliefs. We're not all philosophers, we don't all invent our beliefs. And we also have a commitment, and this is the beginning of geopolitics. Because the most important question of geopolitics is simply this. Why would anyone rush a machine gun position Empirically, we know they will. Empirically, we know this is a fact. But it is the first mystery of geopolitics, because utilitarian philosophers say that all men act out of pleasure. And I've known a utilitarian philosopher who said he gained greater pleasure being killed by a machine gun position than living. This is a point of absurdity that you reach when you push hedonism and utilitarianism so far. It is because there is an element of courage, and a courage that flows from community. And out of this community flows not only love of one's own, but distrust of others. Because there are two ways to make money. One is to work, the other is to steal. Stealing is easier. So everyone around you may have a motive, but certainly among nations, the fear of each other is as natural as the love of one's own. So when we talk about nation and place that you're born, and the time you're born, you must also think about the nation into which you were born. Because your fate and that nation's fate are bound up. There are Americans who say, well, I don't believe in being an American. I believe that, I'm a citizen of the world. This is very good in a very powerful country where nobody can attack you. In a small and weak country, there is no illusion that you have a free fate. Your fate as Russians is your fate. It is bound up with the fate of your country. It may be you can do nothing about it, but that fate is important. It determines something. So, in modern times, there's a belief that we are all individuals shaping our way in the world. And what I've been arguing is this is the grand illusion. You are Russians. I know you're Russians. I'm an American. We have some issues, you and I. And you may say, it's not your issue. Well, okay. Then when the bombs start to fall, I will say, don't bomb Charlie over here, or Igor, because he doesn't think it's his issue. The idea of shared fate is an inevitability. You cannot oppose it. When we look at nations, we also notice that they have certain imperatives. Russia has an imperative. Its enemy is normally to the West. Napoleon, the Austro-Hungarians, the Kaiser, Hitler, all came from the West. The devastation to Russia was catastrophic. What saved you was buffer zones. They had to go a long way to get to Moscow. And each of them failed to reach there. So, why did they fail to reach there? It was a long way. And that bought you time. And so Zhukov's armies could come from Siberia and stand in front of Moscow. And if there wasn't so much time, it wasn't so far, all of your history would be different. So what is your imperative? You must have strategic depth. Everybody must have strategic depth. The United States is an island. Except for that little bit of Panama, North America is an island. What is the American imperative? That the oceans should be American. Because if the oceans are American, no one can come. We can invade Iraq, and the Iraqis can't invade us. This is good if you're an American. Not if you're an Iraqi. But in this world, the illusion of humanity is a dangerous one. Because I'm not an Iraqi, and they are not Americans, and we have different fates. So if I establish the principle of unintended consequence, which I want to start with, and lead you to the idea that you are born inevitably to a place, and your fate is bound up with that place, then I must think about what is the nature of the problem facing that place, and how will it solve it? And if you think about that, which is that Russia must have buffers, and the United States must have the sea, and it really doesn't matter if it's Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, and suddenly they who are so focused on being a president can't really think about the broader question of what is the imperative that drives them. And there are also constraints. Russia has very poor rivers. They don't go together. They don't go to where they need to go. The transportation system is weak, always difficult. This shapes Russia. The United States has only 36 people per square kilometer without Alaska. We don't have enough people, which, believe it or not, can be a serious problem. We have our constraints, you have yours. I'd rather have America's than Russia's. But we all have constraints. For some, it means constant national catastrophe. Poland. For others, it means difficulties. For others, it means successes. If you understand the underlying constraints within the nation state, you can begin to understand what will happen and how they will behave. So let's begin a little understanding. Without talking about leaders or presidents or what President Putin's mood is this week, or does he like Obama, does Obama like him? I can assure you neither care the least about each other. They're presidents, they like who they need to. Let's begin with the year 1992, the year that everything changed. There's a long cycle that began in 1492, when Europe began the process of conquering the world. Up until that point, the Zulus didn't know the Eskimos, the Japanese had never heard of the Aztecs. The world was fragmented. What the Europeans did in 200-300 ruthless, bloody years was tear apart all of these sequestered worlds and jam them together into one. From 1492 to 1992, there was always a European power which was the leading global power. Spain, France, Britain. There was always one. In 1992, for the first time, there was not a single European global power, because the Soviet Union, the last European global power, fell. It fell apart. And all the others were at best regional powers, if that. There was now only one global power in the world, the United States. And for the first time in 500 years, the center of gravity of the global system moved from Europe to North America. And North America, of course, was also the only continent, native to both the Atlantic and the Pacific, in the Pacific Age, was able to trade in both efficiently and also was able to control the seas. Very important. But 1992 was more than just the end of the long cycle and the beginning of a new one. It was also the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, but in that year, the Japanese economic miracle stopped being miraculous. Tiananmen Square happened in '91, which defined what China would be like for the next 20 years. Operation Desert Storm defined the Middle East, gave rise to Al-Qaeda. Tremendous operation, okay? So this was a moment in which everything came together. And of course, no one at the time knew it. They didn't realize it for a moment. It was all separate things. But what the world did was have a major upheaval. What emerged from this was three pillars of the international system. The United States, about 1/4 of the world's GDP, at that time was like 30%. Control of all the world's oceans, no power had ever had that in the world, in history. This was one pillar. The second was Europe. The Maastricht Treaty had been signed in 92 and 91, and in 92 it was assumed that Europe would come together not just economically, but politically and militarily, become a counterweight to the United States, and regain its position as a global power, not alone, but together. And the third was China. In every generation, there is a country that has low wages and high growth rates. Before China was Japan, which was going to overtake the entire world. And in 1880 was the United States, low wages and high growth. So these are the three pillars on which it was founded. In 2008, in 7 weeks, two events undermined this world and began changing it. The first, on August 8th, was Russia's return to history with its war with Georgia. I won't say invasion because you get insulted. But at that moment, Russia announced that its history wasn't over. Russia announced that it would act. It also acted because the United States was in the middle of Iraq and Afghanistan and couldn't do anything about it. But it acted. Russia was back. And all of the truths on which Europe was built, all of the assumptions that America had made were wrong. Russia was not yet a great power or anything like that, but it was back. The second event occurred on September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed. And the collapse of Lehman Brothers created a global crisis which undermined the international financial system, shattered Europe, and undermined China. The United States staggered, then recovered. But an entirely new world was created. Lehman Brothers destroyed the old world. Georgia began defining the new one. Okay? Why did the Russians invade Georgia? Many reasons, but one was to say to Kiev, this is what American guarantees are worth. It was a very good lesson to the countries of the former Soviet Union. And at that time, that's what American guarantees were worth. Now, Europe had this problem. At the center of Europe is Germany, and Germany exports 50% of its GDP. It needs the European Union because half of that goes to the European Union without tariffs or controls. It needs the European Union. But it also undermines Europe. It undermines Europe because how can you develop in a world where Germany, the fourth largest economy, is spewing out product into your market, competing with everything you do? Plus has the rules of Brussels, which basically guarantee there is no Google coming in Germany. Siemens is safe. Okay? How can it do that? The crisis created a sovereign debt crisis, which means countries couldn't pay their debt because suddenly their economies were staggered beyond management. And the question was, would Germany bail out the rest of Europe, or would the rest of Europe have to undergo austerity, which is a nice word for saying devastating poverty? And the Germans said, let me think about this. We could pay for it, or you could pay for it. I know, you pay for it. It was a very difficult thing geopolitically to predict what the Germans would say. Now, if I can show you a map, this is not easy. Okay. This is what happened to Europe. This is the unemployment rates in the south of Europe, and if you break it down by country, so south and north, what you realize is Southern Europe has the same unemployment rate as the United States had in the Great Depression. Southern Europe is in a massive depression. France, not doing so well. Germany's just fine. Remember, I said a nation had a shared fate. Imagine if in the American system, Texas had said, we're not going to help New York. Well, Texas would like to say that, but it's not an option. A shared fate is a foundation of a nation state. This is not a nation state, this is a treaty organization where every power rests with each individual nation. And so what you're seeing here is the fragmentation of Europe back into the constituent nation states. When President Hollande meets Frau Merkel, it is not two European leaders talking, it is the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany, and each are speaking about their own national interests. And they can't agree on anything. Because Germany's interests are fundamentally different from that of Italy. And therefore, I don't need to know what Merkel thinks to know what Merkel thinks. She must protect her chancellorship, and she can't do that if she's giving away money to the Southern. And I know what the Southerners think. And so the European Union, which was once a great idea, I'm not arguing it's going to fail, it's failed. When you see the map, you see failure. The question is, how will they conduct the ballet at the end? Because these numbers, 24% in Spain, is not something you take care of in 6 months. It takes a generation to get rid of those numbers. And the numbers are worse than they appear because they don't take into account, for example, that in Greece, they cut state employees' salaries. And doctors and architects and lawyers are state employees. And we know somebody who earned $3,000 a month, as 3,000 euros a month as an engineer, and they cut his pay to $800 a month. And he will never recover that. And he knows that his future is devastated. And these are the people who constitute the radical right groups. In Spain, the radical left group, Podemos. They're bitter, they're angry. And this is Europe. And these are numbers you have not seen in Europe since the 1920s. And these were the numbers that gave rise to little men with mustaches. It is an enormously dangerous situation. All the more so that the European financial elite doesn't see it. If you read the Financial Times, the banks are okay, so what's the problem? There's the problem. China had a cyclical downturn. We knew it was going to have one. There's always a replacement. But China's problem was that it wanted to have full employment. To have full employment, it needed to have exports. And Germany and China had the same problem. If you're a great exporting power, you depend on the appetite of your customers for your well-being. If your customers don't want your oil or won't pay the price you need, you're hostage. The strength of the United States, we export 11% of our GDP. 3/4 of that to Canada and Mexico. We are not a great exporting power. So what happened was that China weakened because to keep people working full-time, they had to lend money to companies that should go out of business because they were inefficient. And the lending of money rose up the price of wages, so the Chinese wages are now higher than Mexico's. And this is why Chinese companies are moving to Mexico or Russia or anywhere else they can get cheaper wages. This is capital flight, not health. They're running away. So the third pillar, the United States, went a little crazy. After 9/11, it went to war with everybody. Afghanistan, Iraq, whoever. But it wasn't an all-out war. We lost 4,000 people, and my daughter was in the military, so I feel that. She was there. But it was not all-out war. It didn't break us. The way the European Union was broken, the way China is not broken, but changing the way it behaves, as Japan did before it. One of the outcomes of this, of course, was that as Europe weakened, Russia strengthened. Russia was going to strengthen anyway. The situation in the 1990s could not sustain itself. The one entity in the Soviet Union, in the Russian Empire, that was powerful, the security apparatus, reasserted itself. If it had not been Putin, it would have had another name. But it was the only stabilizing force that could rectify the disaster. So in looking at Russia, you could predict that either Russia would collapse, which was not necessary, or a stabilizing force would emerge and very quickly identify what the stabilizing force was, like it or not. And that had certain consequences because of the nature of the force. But it did create a stable entity that built a new economic strategy of exporting energy and other things with the intention of building up from that money a more stable economy. And he promised to reassert Russia as a serious force, which had been held in contempt at Kosovo by the West, where it didn't care what they had to say. Okay. Now, because no one cared what Russia said, NATO moved into the Baltics. But of course, NATO was a joke, because it was a military alliance, and to have a military alliance, you had to have a military. And most of the Europeans had no military. So it became a club for nice people. We wouldn't do anything for you, but we invite you to Brussels to have lunch and make speeches. The United States, however, and this is important, had a long-standing strategy going back a century, which most people don't realize. Their one goal was that no single power would gain hegemony over all of Europe. Because Europe, under one power, was the only thing that could threaten the United States by building fleets, because their greatest fear was Germany and Russia united by whatever means. German technology, German capital, Russian natural resources, Russian manpower, this was a threat to us. In World War I, we carried out the first phase of the strategy. Let them fight. If it looks like one is going to win, get in on the weaker side. So 3 weeks after the Tsar abdicated, the United States declares war, rushes 1 million people to Europe, stabilizes the French, defeats the Germans. At Versailles, prevents the Germans from being destroyed, makes sure that there's a German threat to France, and goes home. All the time having very pious speeches. In World War II, the United States stayed out of the war, really, until June 1944. Until that point, it was content to let the Russians, you, bleed and destroy the Wehrmacht. When the Wehrmacht was done, but before you got to Europe, to Central Europe, the United States invaded. You got Bulgaria, we got France. We did okay. In the Cold War, the entire issue was about the same thing. Germany, Russia, and their fate. And we had the same strategy. An alliance structure, let them fight, and if war breaks out, we'll come in. What did Russia think would happen if they started pushing the United States in Syria? I don't say there's any connection because I don't know what's in anybody's mind. But Russia had become more powerful, more assertive. President Putin said there was a coup in Kiev. I don't know what a coup is, but certainly, very openly, the United States supported the demonstrators. It made square. It wasn't a secret. Is it a coup if it isn't secret? I don't know. These are words I don't understand. What did happen is the United States, facing serious challenge in Syria, happened a few months later to give Russia a problem that it can't solve. Now, this also solves a problem for the United States. Europe is weak, Russia is emerging, the threat of a hegemon is reemerging. Europe can't withstand Russian power, Poland can't, Romania can't, only an alliance structure that actually has some teeth can. And once again, the United States waits. But it waits by posing problems. And the problem of Ukraine is clear. The American strategic imperative has been in place for a century. Anytime a serious challenger to European hegemony emerges, we act. We watch the Germans, we watch the Russians, we worry about the Germans and the Russians together. But in the meantime, we like very much the situation where the Russians are held back to the east. The Russians have an imperative. They cannot allow Ukraine to be in the hands of enemies. They don't have to dominate it, but it must be neutral. It must be a real buffer. And so, you wind up in the situation we're in now. Totally predictable. So when I saw Russia rising, when I saw Europe weakening, when I know what the United States does, even though it doesn't think about it, I can tell you that you are in a situation where there is no easy solution. Russia cannot give America guarantees that will calm it. The United States can't give Russia what it wants and needs. Wars do not break out, conflicts do not break out because he's not nice and I am. Sometimes it is. But they break out because of fundamental differences. And we have now faced a fundamental difference. So I began by talking about your friend who's ugly wanting to be in Hollywood. And I wound up talking about the Ukraine. In a certain sense, they're the same subject. In a certain sense, they're the same thing. It is seeing the thing that is right before your eyes. Every intelligence agency thinks that if they steal it, it must be true. The truth, the most important truth, is right there. You look at how a nation behaves, how it must behave, what the constraints are, what the realities are, and you know that Russia will frighten the United States. And you know that the United States has options, and it will try to thwart Russia. Russia can't live with that. The United States can't live with it. And so it goes. It becomes more complicated. There are many complexities that I didn't mention. But this is how strategic forecasting allows you to work. So let me stop and ask questions. I ran over my time, I think. Sir.
Thank you for this lecture. My name is Rob Gavazov. I'm just on the second meal. I decided to become a lawyer. I know it's kind of, well, for a lawyer, it's kind of dangerous to talk about politics, but, well, I love politics. So you mentioned about broadcasting the conflicts, and, well, there is a really interesting book on, well, it's not written by Tom Clancy himself, one of my favorite authors, but it's written under his license. It's called Tom Clancy's End War. According to the story, well, you mentioned keywords like Europe, GDP, and, well, warfare. And the thing is, according to the book, the European Union became fully independent. It had its own military, and they created the European Federation. And, well, they became this new superpower, the new technology, high GDP and population in the U.S. Do you really believe that it can happen in this situation, and will it be some sort of an opponent for the U.S.? Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, and I'm a little deaf, I think, you're asking the question of, could Europe have a united military?
Yeah, and even stronger than the U.S.
It could if the French and the Germans trusted each other. If the Italians wanted to raise an army. So what the problem is, there is a common understanding that everybody wants to be rich. This is the foundation of Europe. If I join the European Union, I'm going to be rich like Germany. The reality is that they're not rich. Now, the idea that having the basic reason for creating a European Union expand to a military under the same general command as Germany has, but I mean, Germany doesn't want a military. Germany's very happy with the situation it has. So the answer is, if they could form a united entity, they would, yes, and it would be powerful as the United States. The weakness of the entire problem is these are separate nations with centuries of fear and hatred of each other. They don't trust each other, with good reason. And it's very difficult to imagine anybody but the United States being under the command of these forces. The only reason the United States could do that is we had more troops and bombs and everything, but also We didn't want anything from them. We wanted them to do their fighting. We didn't intend to take anything. The Germans want something from the Italians. The Spaniards want something from the Germans, so it becomes more complicated. You? Does he have?
Sir, thank you for a lecture. In your geopolitics series, you claimed that the natural western border of Russia should be the Carpathian Mountains, if I'm correct. Do you think we'll eventually be able to reach it, or do you stick to your prognosis, to your forecast made in your book, The World in the 21st Century, where you have said that we will be torn apart by 2020? And that is the first question, and the second one is...
But that's more than enough. Let me try that one.
I just wanted to ask how to create a Russian Stratfor as powerful as your organization. Thank you.
I didn't know I was powerful. Thank you. Look, the natural boundary that would protect Russian interests would be the Carpathians. But the problem is that the North European plain is undefended and indefensible. So even if they reach there, they're vulnerable in the north, Russia's north. I am very pessimistic about the future of Russia, not because I'm anti-Russian. Russia depends, President Putin's strategy was to build Russia on the revenue of natural resource sales. That was a good strategy. It didn't happen. You are dependent on the worst sort of product. First, you're dependent for your customers buying your stuff. And secondly, you are dependent on a product in which technology is revolutionizing availability. Temporarily, the problem is that China is not growing as fast as they thought. The BRIC countries are slowing down. Europe is in near recession. So naturally, the price will go down eventually. But that's a cyclical problem. The structural problem is something that was not anticipated. It was technological, which was that in Texas, they would invent ways to get it oil that didn't exist before. And everybody said, this is wonderful. What they didn't anticipate was that between recession and the technology, prices would plunge. Russian national economy depends on the price of oil. And if they can't get that price, and if the quantity absorbed declines, if they have competition for markets, then you wind up in a very difficult situation for Russia. And the problem that I argued was that the fundamental weakness of the Soviet Union, which was an internal incoherence of economies, continues in the Russian Federation. And particularly because I saw Russia rising, I saw all sorts of international forces coming down on Russia, the sanctions being very mild beginning. So Russia rising threatens many interests. Its economy has not developed as expected. Technology has perhaps permanently started to depress the price of oil. There aren't many. How does it hold together? How does this entity hold together at this point? And between the international pressures that Russia must bring upon itself as it pursues its national interests, like its interests in Ukraine, which are real and genuine, and the economic situation, it's very difficult to see. Not that it will necessarily break apart, but it has an inherent downside that is built into the system that creates structures that are difficult to predict. So I continue with the argument. I made the argument that Ukraine in 2015, I missed by a year, would become a major battleground. And then I argued out of that the Russian Federation would have a great deal of difficulty. There are parts of it that will do very well, parts of it that won't, but you can't live with a map like this. Sir?
So, I would like to shift the focus of our discussion for a while from very important...
Could you speak up, please?
I would like to shift the focus of our discussion for a while from really important geopolitical stuff
Could you please speak up?
I've got a very personal question. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I'm married.
Personal question. Answering that question, I can understand. So, first, I would like to recall that George Cameron, the founding father of the famous strategy, first director of the policy planning staff, and one of his greatest strategists of the 20th century, in his article, in his article published according to various sources of the Soviet conduct, referred to a novel by Thomas Mann, the Wood brothers, who visualized his ideas about the Soviet future, etc. So, my question is whether you have a set of authors, writers, or philosophers whose writings have enormously and profoundly impacted your analytical skills, the lenses through which you perceive reality, and your lines.
Well, before I got an honest job, I was a professor of political philosophy. So, well, I mean, I was getting to that, and the one that I loved to teach the most was Thucydides. Because if you read Thucydides, where he describes the difference between Athens, the maritime city, and Sparta, the inland city, and the strength of the Spartan soldiers and the cleverness of the Athenians, I mean, this was the beginning of all geopolitics. Now, there are many after him that, I learned from. Hegel was one. Because when he spoke about the real being rational and the rational real, it sounds crazy. And he realized that he's saying, look, there is a logic and a necessity to the human condition. Humans did not simply lurch upward to this point. There was necessity there. So, I mean, the two poles that influenced me the most, I dedicated my motto in the next 100 years was from Hegel, and Thucydides was the other one. And they really are, it was, had I not taught political philosophy, I don't think I could have developed this theory, if it's any good, without it. So yes, I do have to.
Fridman, thank you very much for your lecture. How do you think the current shale gas revolution in the United States will change its political and economic positions in the Western Hemisphere? Thank you.
The United States, given an option, is an isolationist power. For the 20th century, except for the periods that intervened in the First World War, Second World War, and the extended involvement in the Cold War, because the Soviet strategy was wars of national liberation in Vietnam and other places, we were constantly trying to counter that. If we look at that, we see that the United States really is not a country that has an enormous interest in Eurasia, except that Eurasia not unite. If we have an option, the United States, precisely because we are now, North America is now at a point of essential energy independence. And you really have to think of Mexico and Canada and NAFTA as a single integrated entity, because that's how it behaves. Therefore, the desire in the United States is disengagement. It's very difficult to do, because we also want to have successful outcomes to conflicts, and we want to disengage. And so the United States is caught in its immaturity between two needs. But I think what it really does, it means our dependence on Saudi Arabia is no longer there. We can talk to Iran and not care what Saudi Arabia thinks. It means that our relationship to Israel can be more distant than it was. The entire Middle East becomes far less important to us. So the problem is, how do we get out of the Middle East? This is what President Obama is trying to cope with, and if George W. Bush had been president, he'd be coping with the same problem. How can he disengage without that? The one thing we can't disengage from is a rising Russia, because it is too powerful to ignore, but weak enough that it can be dealt with now cheaply. And that's the problem. Never scare the United States while you're still weak.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My question is, can you describe current geopolitical situation as a second Cold War, or just simply tension in relations between the US and the Russian Federation? Thank you.
The Cold War had two dimensions to it. One was a nuclear standoff, which must not be belittled. And the second, that because of containment, the Soviet Union created brilliant strategy of alliances to the rear of containment and wars of national liberation. Okay? Didn't matter who, they would fund. This was a very different war. We still have, and this is not a trivial danger, I mean, the fact that Russia has a trump card in its nuclear weapons can never be ignored. I mean, there's a limit to how far we can push Russia. And what a forecast that I just said, is frightening when you think about Russia desperate. So you can't make Russia too desperate. I'm not even sure this will turn into a war. This will be a kind of unpleasant grinding against each other, I think, for an extended period of time. Neither side wants war. So I think it's very misleading when people say second Cold War. It's not even a Cold War. It is a divergence of interests that are hard to define. But the Cold War, I was there. It was different.
What is the role of Commonwealth of Nations and its soft power in modern international relations? And does its soft power pose threat to U.S. global domination?
Soft power is what people who have no hard power claim is going to be very effective. No, I mean, the Europeans developed this myth of soft power because they didn't want to have a defense budget. And yeah, well, they were very rich. They could give people money, and the people would take the money. But when they became poor, they laughed at the Europeans. So, I mean, soft power has certain advantage. If the United States is liked, there's a certain advantage. If we're not liked, we're going to do the same thing. So I think we have to be very careful when we talk about power to be very clear on what it means. It means coercion, that you can coerce somebody, that you can use money or whatever. Soft power means that they really like you and they want to do what you want to do. This is like going to a nightclub and the girls really like you until they find out you don't have any money. That's soft power. No, I'm not her. I like her better than you.
Thank you so much, first, for the joy. Well, my question may seem a little dumb, but if Hillary becomes president, because she is bad, as we know, how would the politics toward Russia change? That's the first. And secondly, how would the immigration policy change?
First, I want you to take a look at Obama. What he came to power wanting to do, and how little his presidency differed from George W. Bush's. To understand that a president is not that powerful in the United States, and he's trapped in reality. I mean, first the founders created a system. He is not the government of the United States. He's 1/3 of the government, and mostly not the most important. In foreign policy, he has more power. So when you ask the question what Hillary would do about it, who cares what Hillary would do about it? What will Congress do about it?
Well, President Obama, there's such a thing as the executive power, right?
You can use that executive power when the last election is over that you have to be running in, and you don't care what happens. In other words, Hillary, you can't use that when you take office, because you will never get anything else through Congress. I'm not sure that the Supreme Court will let him do this anyway, because there's a third branch of government that's there. But the point I'm making is, many people, particularly in this region, vastly overestimate the American president as if he's godlike. Obama never thought he would have this presidency. He didn't want this presidency. He wanted to do he wanted Merkel to like him. Merkel doesn't like anybody, but he thought that she would like him. He wanted to get out of the Middle East. He made a speech in Cairo where he thought everybody wouldn't love, and it turned out they didn't. When you look back in his presidency, it was a continuation of the Bush presidency. Why? Because Bush didn't pick the path. When he took office, the last thing he thought he would do was invade Afghanistan. You know, if you said to him, Mr. President, do you realize in a year you're going to be invading Afghanistan? What are your plans? There were no plans. He never expected 9/11. 9/11 happened because Bill Clinton did not take Al-Qaeda seriously enough, did not conduct a vigorous war. And Bill Clinton got that job because Bush decided to go to Saudi Arabia. So each president inherits the problem that the other president has. And each believes that, and campaigns saying, you know, that I am going to be everything you want me to be. And then he becomes an American president. So if you follow what I'm saying, the personality of your leaders is not that important. I said if Putin hadn't been the one to take power, another member of the FSB would have emerged. This was not what you wanted, not what they wanted, it was what was going to happen. So Hillary will do almost exactly the same thing as the Republican candidate, but she will make very different speeches. And that is the point that I'm making, and the truth. It doesn't matter. I never vote in elections. The only time my vote counts is if it's a tie. It's never a tie. I stay home, drink beer, and watch television.
Thank you, Mr. Fridman, for your speech and for your book, Next 100 Years too. My question is about the international organizations, especially the UN. What do you see will be the role of the UN in the 21st century? Because in your book, it was, if I'm not mistaken, international organizations were not mentioned, and I just wonder what would be the role of the UN?
None? No. Here's where the UN becomes useful. When all of the leading powers in the Security Council want something, peacekeepers, some other non-controversial thing, the United Nations becomes very useful because it becomes an instrument that no one nation has to be involved. So when we look at, for example, the Yugoslavian Civil War and its end, where everybody, except the Russians, when even the Russians bought in, wanted a certain outcome, it was good. During the Cold War, the United Nations had very little use because the distinction between the Soviets and the Americans was so deep that it was paralyzed as an organization. I don't know that it'll be paralyzed. It still has its uses, but it's not a decisive force in preventing war. And so the argument is, my argument would be that it has a useful function, but a limited one, and certainly no power. I have to go here, I think.
Thank you for your speech. My question is, you were talking about controlling unknown variables and controlling, so basically that we can predict everything. Don't you give any chance to, any percentage to chance or luck, or is it important in analytical work? And another more real question is, actually we are all human beings and we can't be rational to 100%, so how many analysts do you need to, I don't know, analyze a more or less simple international situation, like, for example, in the Middle East or what's happening in Ukraine? And what do you need to have, what qualities?
There are any number of accidents that can happen to a human being. You're on your way to being the next Einstein, you walk out and you get hit by a car. You're not going to be the next Einstein. In nations of 300 million or 100 million people, it's more difficult to have the car hitting, okay? It's not that people are rational in the sense that they fully understand where they're going. They're just very good at the job they do. So the presidents are very good at becoming effective as presidents. And in that sense, there's a certain level of random choice. What is our policy toward Argentina, the United States? I don't think we have a policy, but if we did, it would be an accident. So surely there are many, many things that are accidental. But can the fundamental course of vast institutions simply be an accident? It's hard to do because there are so many balancing and counterbalancing powers. Countries don't survive for 200 years, 300 years, 500 years. There can be miscalculations, in a sense, about Napoleon invading Russia. But in the end, it didn't matter because Russia did what it had to do, even if it miscalculated, and defeated them. So sure, there are many levels under which accidents could happen, right? But in the same way that a recession, we're very comfortable in economics saying a recession is going to happen, and then not saying, well, Obama wanted a recession. It had nothing to do with what Obama wanted or Putin wanted or anything else. Economic cycles are not in people's control. If you're head of a corporation and you say, I'm going to invest all of my money in Chinese stocks. I don't care any longer about the business I'm in making cars, I'm going to invest. The system would not permit you. It would stop you. And you can't do just anything because as a head of a corporation, you have to deal with the market, the prices, and these are all realistic things. And if you're not good at that, you're removed. We're very comfortable in economics at thinking of unplanned events, recessions, unintended events. We're very good at thinking in terms of a corporate head being forced to be rational. But somehow when we get to politics, we disengage from the obvious notions of rationality, and we assume that it is a whim. I think this goes back to the monarchies, where the idea that the king somehow had a wisdom, and he could have visions of whatever he willed would happen. Well, read Machiavelli's Prince. So I would argue to you that there is accident, there is probability, businesses fail. But usually not because the president is stupid. The CEO usually has made decisions and they were going to fail anyway. But if you take seriously the idea of corporate rationality, and you take seriously the idea of unintended consequences, then you need to move to the idea that this could apply to political life as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I was really interested in how Americans see their future, because all the evening we were speaking about Russian future and how we see ourselves. But you, as an American citizen, what can you say and tell us about how you see the future of your own country?
I don't look at it as most Americans. Most Americans feel that everything is terrible, the world is collapsing. But we have, ever since I was young, in the Vietnam War, and the Depression before I was born. And we're the most depressive nation in the world politically and the most optimistic nation personally. So if you ask the person, what do you think your children are going to be? They're going to be great. Okay? If you ask him, what do you think the political future is now? He says, it's just terrible. There's no hope. This Obama's an idiot. Or George Bush is an idiot.
No, but what about the real things that you can analyze yourself?
From my point of view, the United States is the overwhelming center of gravity of the international system. Whether it's liked or not, whether it is admired or not, it is a quarter of the world's economy. As I said, it controls the oceans. It also is a place that has one terrific advantage that we never talk about. It is very good at managing immigrants. So Germany, Europe is struggling with the idea of the Islamic immigrants. we're also struggling with the idea of Mexican immigrants. How could we build a wall but make sure they get through? In other words, we know we need them. We've just integrated Indians and Chinese in huge numbers to the point where the Indians are the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States in 30 years. In a world of declining population, the ability to absorb efficiently large numbers of immigrants is a tremendous advantage to the United States. When we look at that, plus the fact that American culture, in the name of computers, has redefined the entire world. And if you want to program, you're going to program in English. In other words, the cultural imperialism of the United States. It's just an overwhelming force. We are in the position, really, of Britain at least, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it hasn't even begun to unfold. I say this not as a patriot, or I am one, but I hope I can also, I see the weaknesses. You know, race relations is still, you know, bad, but underneath it all, the United States doesn't face the kind of challenges other countries face and can project power tremendously. It is not necessarily liked. So you ask a question of people, what country do you least like frequently in the United States? Which country would you most like to live in except that you're your own? The United States. So this is a paradox. But subjective interpretations are not what I'm looking at. I mean, how does a country with that high a GDP it takes a long time for anybody to overcome that.
What do you think about WikiLeaks and their message of work?
I hate it. Are you kidding me? I think WikiLeaks' method of work is it has a website. And if somebody else steals something, they'll put it on there. Julian Assange is now a genius. So the people that are interesting are not WikiLeaks. The people who are interesting are the people who, Manning, for example, Snowden. I mean, these are interesting people. And, you know, there's an interesting question. Did it hurt the United States to have these things revealed? And the answer is interesting because really it didn't. For everything Snowden revealed, we're still doing it. And by the way, everybody knew we were doing it because they were helping us. Secondly, for all the information that was revealed on the State Department, it showed me that the diplomats are not as stupid as they sounded when I met them. As to what they did to us, evil, terrible people. No, the point is, I didn't like it. It was an extremely unpleasant experience, but I'm here. And now that even Sony had its emails stolen, I feel much better. Pick him. He wins.
Do you think that sheerly publishing this book made your predictions, and if it's read by, say, a president of Russia who is seen unfavorably with conditions in your book, if they actually dedicated a lot of work to try to reverse what you claim is going to happen, do you think they could actually overcome these barriers you mentioned?
Well, firstly, political leaders don't read books. They're too busy. Secondly, they won't read my book, certainly. And thirdly, they wouldn't believe it. To become a Putin or an Obama, you have to have a belief in yourself and your own power. You may not have this power, but you have to believe in it. All right? So if I were to say to either of these people, your country's in trouble and will decline, they will immediately assume that it's either nonsense or not under me it can't. To become a leader of a country of millions, you have to have an enormous ego. Not to the point of irrationality, but if you don't have a self-confidence subjectively, you can't become a leader. No one ever became a leader without a huge ego. And therefore, when a seedy little guy like me writes a book and it predicts something, it's discounted. So this is why I don't think the Heisenberg effect governs here.
you very much. My name is Andrew Kirko, and I'm a master's student here at МГИМО. I also work at a Sputnik News Agency. I'd like to ask for a short forecast about something, actually. What do you think? Do you think that the emerging Russian-Turkish partnership can be just as important, if not more so, than the Russian-German partnership? And what does this portend for the Western Balkans? For example, can we see the return of trilateral competition there, but with the EU replacing Austria-Hungary? Thank you.
Well, the answer that I would give is, who said it's an emerging relationship? I mean, it remains to be seen.
Well, I mean, in terms of the new energy pipeline, the new South Stream.
Okay, everybody take a breath. Energy is like milk. You have to have it, but the place is swimming in it. There was a period 5 years ago where pipeline politics defined geopolitics. Today, it doesn't. It doesn't because of the new geometry of energy, which is still unfolding. Russia suspended South Stream. This hurt Bulgaria terribly. But it really doesn't change the game. If Turkey becomes a hub for Russian oil, this will be of great benefit to Russia. And Turkey, which is a very seriously rising power, okay, will not change its policy in the Balkans one bit because of that. So I don't see this as a constraint at this point. If something dramatic would happen to take great amount of oil offline, you know, possibly. The Balkans, I mean, I think there will be a competition in the Balkans between Turkey, to some extent Russia, but not the EU, because there is no EU to compete. As Zbigniew Brzezinski said, when I want to call Moscow, I know how to call Moscow. When I want to call Tokyo, I know how to... What number do I dial for Europe? So the Germans may have interests in that direction, but they're far away from exercising them. I think a Balkan competition of serious... It would require the rise of Turkey to a level where Russia would have to respond, or the United States. And that would be, I mean, that's a hard place to compete, unless you have a pressing reason. So I would argue that pipeline politics don't simply drive anymore. That's why South Stream was canceled. I mean, the Russians just didn't see the point. And if it did, you know, become an issue in the region, we're far away from that region becoming hot. They will kill themselves on their own. I mean, I don't believe for a second that the Balkan wars are over. I mean, I say this, you know, regretfully, but the issues that were there have not been settled, and they weren't trivial.
As you said, whenever there was a rising power in Europe, the US was somewhat intervened to balance the situation. But nowadays, there's an enormous power rising in Asia, like, you know, China, and there's also quite a strong Russia. So how do you forecast this? US strategy would be to try to deal with both such powers at the same time.
Well, firstly, in Asia, China is not as strong as it appears. Geographically, it can't move to the south because of jungles and hills. And when it tried to attack Vietnam in 1978, it lost. The Himalayas means that only in the newspapers can there be a competition, a war between India and China. To the north is Siberia, they're not crazy, and to the west is the steppes of Kazakhstan. The People's Liberation Army is a domestic domestic security force. It is not an effective power projection tool. If you take a look at the geography of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, they're both enclosed. They can be easily blocked in many ways. The Chinese very shortly may have their first aircraft carrier, but they have never had a fleet action. They are not a naval power. It's very easy to have one ship, but a carrier battle group is an aircraft carrier, an anti-aircraft cruiser, 2 anti-submarine destroyers, and 1 or 2 attack submarines, not counting all the support vessels. If you've ever seen these in action, it's like a ballet. The United States has been doing this since the 1930s. So we're very good at it. There's not a single Chinese admiral who has ever conducted combat with a carrier battle group. He's never even sailed with one. It takes a long time, and you're going to need at least 10 of those to take on the United States. The United States has absolutely no intention of invading China. China has no ability to take on the US Navy. There's no conflict. The only time you hear of conflict is when the US Navy's budget comes up. And then you will hear stories about the terrible Chinese Navy and how it will destroy us immediately. My son's in the Air Force, and he's in the Space Command. And we suddenly had a report about a Chinese anti-satellite taking out one of our satellites. So I called him and asked him, when are the budget hearings? He said, why? Just tell me when the budget hearings are. 3 weeks. So the greatest advocate of Chinese power is the US military. You know, this is where their funding comes from. Therefore, we don't have to deal with China.
Thank you for an amazing lecture and very interesting answers. I'd like to ask the following. Is there any perspective for the greater Middle East concept?
I didn't hear you.
Is there any perspective for the greater Middle East concept?
Well, I mean, the only meaningful Middle East concept that I know of is the Caliphate. And that's a greater Middle East concept. From the basic reality of the Middle East, of the Islamic world, is deep divisions. Not just Arabs against Persians, Sunnis against Shiites, but deep regional hostilities, tribal hostilities that you see in Lebanon, Libya, I mean. So it's very difficult to imagine a caliphate emerging from this. If that were to emerge, that would change the entire dynamic of the global system. But I don't see how it can. I don't see who would lead it, that would be trusted. There's a reason the Islamic world is as fragmented as it is. The only country that could create a greater Middle East is Turkey. Whenever there is a unified entity in the Middle East, it's Turkey. And so I would argue that watching Turkey, which I think is a rising power and a very important one, not quite ready to compete what you're talking about, but Turkey could create some sort of entity, but it's fighting against being drawn in. It doesn't want, it knows the price it has to pay. It's not ready to pay the price.
All right. Mr. Fridman, I have a question. It's a bit practical. So the Ukrainian elites say they want to join NATO. Some of the US officials say we want to see Ukraine in NATO. German foreign minister says we don't need Ukraine in NATO. So there's an obvious controversy within the Union. And Russia does everything it can to prevent this scenario. And the question is now obviously that Ukraine is not joining NATO at the moment, but how do you see the future of this problem? Is it possible in your mind?
Well, the real question is, what does it mean to join NATO? So, NATO is an organization that most of the members have no military power. NATO is essentially an organization which can legitimize American military action and occasionally, you know, send some help here and there. But it is not a functioning military alliance. The United States finds it useful on rare occasion. They will all agree, and the United States can do something it wants and claim the legitimacy of NATO. Secondly, the United States may say that it wants Ukraine in NATO, but it's trying just to drive the Russians crazy. The United States does not want to see, it does not want to have a NATO-style commitment to Ukrainian territory. If it goes into conflict, it really doesn't want to fight deep into Ukraine. I mean, not if it does, at least wants to retain its choice. Once Ukraine is a member of NATO, the United States loses that choice. Where an attack on one of us is an attack on all. The Germans will send 2 fighter planes and a tank. We send over 15 divisions. It doesn't work for us. So again, it's, you know, you want to jerk the Russian tail. The Russians like jerking ours in Syria and places like that. That's what it feels like. We really have to understand each other. The Russians have to understand there are limits to what they can do, say, in the Middle East without exciting American interest. The United States has to realize that if you want to drive the Russians crazy and push them even farther in a direction you don't want them to go, just keep talking about NATO. But that's just noise. The reality is much deeper.
Boys and girls, can we have 2 last questions, please?
You pick them. Okay, I'll pick them. Who? You. There you go.
Thank you very much. My question is, will the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan somehow reshape the international system?
Will somehow do what to the international system?
Will it reshape, will it change the international system? And will it change the Russian imperative as a nation? Because we will get a new threat in Central Asia. Thank you.
Well, you don't need a new threat in Central Asia to shape your behavior. You have plenty of threats in Asia that make you do the same thing. And mostly you can't cope with them as threats. I mean, it's difficult to you. I mean, Afghanistan is Afghanistan. Its basic threat is to Pakistan. And Pakistan basically has a responsibility, with Iran also having some. It is not a matter of fundamental interest to the United States. We got in there to destabilize Al-Qaeda. That's succeeded. We didn't leave. Under Bush, there was very little military activity because it wasn't necessary. Obama made it a very active theater of operations as an alternative to Iraq. But in truth, the United States, I can't imagine a country where the United States has less interest than Afghanistan. But it's one of those things, you know, when you ask, can there be accidents? Yeah, I mean, sort of 9/11 triggered a series of accidents that didn't really change things fundamentally. Can it destabilize Central Asia? I mean, I don't think by itself it destabilizes Central Asia. Central Asia can destabilize itself very nicely. It has Tajikistan, after all. Yes? I mean, pleading helps. You guys.
Thank you very much. Could you tell us, please, whether the problem of the Iranian nuclear program is going to...
Excuse me, louder.
Whether the problem of the Iranian nuclear program is going to be solved soon and may Iran become another U.S. regional ally soon?
To build a nuclear weapon, having refined uranium is not nearly enough. You have to have a reliable missile, and you have to have a weapon that can go up at 10 Gs, enter vacuum, have temperature swings of 300 plus to 300 minus degrees Fahrenheit, and then re-enter the atmosphere at 5,000 degrees. And then land in the middle of Tel Aviv and go off. Because if it lands in the middle of Tel Aviv and it doesn't go off and the tail says made in Iran, you have some serious problems in Iran. In other words, one of the truths is that the Iranians are far from having a nuclear weapon. And they've used the nuclear program they have, particularly enriched uranium, as a bargaining tool to shape its relationships with the United States as an offer to go away. Right now, both Iran and the United States have more serious problems in Iraq. Both of them want the Islamic State to be crushed. They're cooperating tactically with airstrikes and everything else. And so what would have been a major event 2 years ago, you know, the nuclear talks didn't reach anything. Basically, Kerry walked away and said, we'll come back to it in a few months. And the The Iranians said, yeah, we'll be seeing you. In the meantime, the operations in Iraq went on. In other words, this was never the threat it appeared. We did not believe there would ever be airstrikes against it. They learned it from the Koreans, the North Koreans, how to make a lot of money out of a nuclear program. Because we kept paying them to not do it anymore until we got tired and said, God, do it. So understand that the United States has a well-known nuclear phobia. And nations have learned that you want to manipulate the United States. It's much better to have a nuclear program than a nuclear weapon. An effective nuclear weapon with a delivery system will have a very unpleasant consequence. A program that's very close, 2 weeks away from having enriched uranium is much better. How many times has it appeared that the Iranians were a year away for the past 5 years? So understanding what the Iranians are doing and why, understanding how the Americans respond, will give you the answer. And also a little technology. It's hard to build a nuclear weapon. Okay,
George,
thank you.
I will allow one more question from that side.
You pick it.
You pick it.
Assess the future of their responsibility to protect principle.
To protect it?
Responsibility to protect principle.
To protect principle? Excuse me? The principle protect what?
Can we have a bit of explanation, please?
Please, could you? I really don't understand.
There's a principle that changed the responsibility to protect that appeared in Washington in 2002 under the auspices of the Canadian government. And it replaced it was supposed to replace the principle of humanitarian intervention. So, what do you think will be the future of this principle?
Well, given the fact that I haven't even heard of it, and I should, I don't think this is a very powerful principle. No, excuse me?
There was an article in the American Interest magazine in August 2013 about Martin principle.
I mean, if you have a principle, people have to know of it. You can't just announce one.
George, if I may, it's a principle that says basically, if you want to invade another country, find an unhappy person there.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.